Thank you everyone for coming back from the break. We have an exciting panel on cultures of expertise in the UK. In the UK macroeconomics. As I said, it's a very, very exciting day. Chairing this panel is Professor Gary Dymski from the Faculty of Leeds University Business School, and also a co-leader for the Research Hub Macroeconomic Institutions here at the Rebuilding Macro. So I'm honored as well to be introducing Gary because Gary is that professor that has been very supportive to academia in general, but also how economic academia interact with policymaking in other institutions. I could be here for another 10 minutes introducing Gary and his expertise in, monetary economics, macroeconomic theory, banking, financial institutions, and his career visiting, Brazil, Bangladesh, Colombia, Greece, and, everywhere. So it's amazing to have him chairing not only this, panel, but also being the co-leader of that very important research hub. So before I pass the word to Gary, I also would like to thank the director of NIESR, who is actually the discussant in that panel. As I said, this panel is about understanding how our field is shaped, the social hierarchies in our field, and I can't really think of someone better than Chadha to discuss what's happening because he knows our profession, our field from inside out. So thank you, and Gary is with you now.
Thank you very much. I want to thank you for that kind introduction, Carolina, and I too want to thank the team at the Rebuilding Macro, Angus Armstrong, Richard Arnold, Carla Koberger, for their efforts in this project. We have a great conference, which I think is a testimony to their dedication to the idea of opening up macroeconomics to new methodologies and interdisciplinary links. This is something that's more needed than ever as we bounce from one crisis and are in the midst of another. I've led, as mentioned, the institution's hub, along with Professor Laura Baer of LSE, and two of the projects that we've funded were focused on micro and meso projects that were discussed yesterday, aspects that were discussed yesterday. The projects today that we'll go through are focusing on what's been called in this project cultures of expertise. So we've got three panelists and then a discussant. And to ensure a robust debate, breaking the pattern of the last 2 days, we'll have each paper in sequence. Do put your questions into the chat box. And when you do so, please remember to direct them to all panelists, to panelists and participants, to everyone so everyone can see. And we'll hear first from Dr. Carlo D'Ippoliti, Associate Professor of Political Economy at the Department of Statistical Sciences at Sapienza University of Rome. Then we'll turn to Dr. Beatrice Cherrier, Associate Professor specializing in the history of economics at the University of Cergy-Pontoise, France. And third, we'll have Dr. Danielle Guizzo, Senior Lecturer in Economics at the University of Bristol. Our discussant today will be Dr. Jagjit Chadha, Director of the National Institute for Economic and Social Research, which, as noted, has hosted the Rebuilding Macro project. Carlo, take it away.
Thank you, Gary. So, good morning, everybody. I'm going to present the results of a research project financed by Rebuilding Macroeconomics that we have done with a few colleagues at the University of Rome, La Sapienza. And our project has mainly focused on citation networks and UK economics. As such, I'm sorry. It's part of a growing literature on the structures of economics as a scientific field and on the economics profession in general. I should say possibly there is some sample selection in the sort of economists, historians, or sociologists that decide to study these topics, or be as it may. Normally in this literature, it is found that economics is a very hierarchical field, more than the other social sciences, that is not very inclusive. So to do some examples, the American Economic Association last year made a very large-scale survey of its members and other economists, finding that 30% of women feel they have been discriminated against in the economics profession, or even, I think we don't discuss enough, then 25% of the whole sample, not just women or minorities, agrees with the statement that my ideas and opinions are often ignored within the field. Now, my main concern today is to say that these sort of biases that many people find either when they study economics from outside or when they relate their personal experience need not necessarily be associated with bad faith or unscientific behavior on the side of specific economists. Instead, they arise from some structural characteristics of the field, constraints and incentives that are being given to the individuals. So, for example, one recent paper has adopted a network perspective, as we do in our own project, and Colucci has looked at the relations between editors and authors in the top journals, finding that authors who have some personal connection with the editors, possibly because they work in the same university or they are the former PhD students or they've been co-authors in the past, are more likely to be able to access the journals. So they're more likely to be able to publish, and also to publish longer articles. Often this is this sort of evidence, there is a lot of evidence about my own country, Italy or Spain, for example, is associated to the idea of corruption. Instead, I would like to highlight that there are larger phenomena at play, one of which is the widespread use of bibliometric indexes. You may know there is a very interdisciplinary debate about what should be the role of citation counts for the aims of research evaluation. I believe Danielle is going to partly talk about it in her own talk in a few minutes. However, what I think is very relevant is that possibly as opposed to many other scientists, economists have been largely in favor of considering citations as proxies or measures of the scientific quality of works. So for example, in the last round of the REF, even though the evaluation of products was to be done by means of peer review, ex post, some colleagues have found that the ratings are very much correlated with the journal impact factor of the products, possibly highlighting that the referees themselves, when they evaluate a paper, keep the journal very much in mind. Now, there is an obvious explanation for this. The economics literature has literally exploded. Here you have the yearly number of papers, new papers on REPEC, or the number of active researchers in a period, a 5-year period. As you can see, every year on REPEC, I know this is the most comprehensive data set, but still it's interesting. Every year in REPEC, more than 30,000 new unique works are being added. By unique, I mean that we are computing these statistics, even taking away duplications, such as papers published in 2 or more working papers series or working papers then published as articles. So more than 30,000 new papers every year. I think it is obvious that nobody can be expected to read even a fraction of this number. However, this does not imply that we should so easily resort to citations. There are many problems associated with citations. There is, again, a very large interdisciplinary literature. But what is more relevant to my project today is that people can have 2 sorts of reasons to cite somebody else. So on the one hand, if I'm writing a paper and I decide to cite, I don't know, Gary Dymski, it may be because of intellectual debt. Maybe in my own paper, I have built on his works, or I think that my readers should know about some of the things that he has written in the past, but also very often there can be social reasons. So there have been anthropological studies of economics behavior, or there have been more aggregate studies as the one that we propose today. But let's make first an example at the global scale before going to the UK case. So the idea is when you consider a community of scholars, two sorts of phenomena could emerge that Irving Collier has called clubs and clans. So a club, in his view, would be a community that is not really inclusive, in which it is difficult to enter, possibly not only on meritocratic grounds. And the clan is a community of people that over the years accumulate a loyalty to each other so that blood is thicker than water, so to say. Let's make an example at the global level, as I said. Now, as the economics profession is growing, many papers are being added every year to REPEC, many more people are visible, let's say also more visible to us in the Western and Northern part of the globe. You see that the share of citations that go to the top 1% of the most cited papers, authors, the top country, and the top institutions, they all decrease over time. So in a sense, you could even be tempted to interpret this as a sort of democratization of the economics debate. However, if you consider only the papers that are published in the top 5 journals, a totally different pictures emerge. There's no longer a decreasing trend. And in fact, in terms of which papers are cited, there's even an increasing trend. So the result is that basically, if you were to picture yourself what is economics today by only reading the top 5 journals, you would have a very limited picture of economics. This is what I mean when I talk about clubs. You have a community of people that are clearly talking among themselves, and they are less aware, possibly even a little less interested about what happens outside. This is, in a sense, understandable given the size of the fields, but it can create problems, of which I'm talking now. So let's consider the UK case. This is important to show that the sort of club phenomena are not just taking place at the top, which often means actually in the top economics department in the USA. It is very much a global phenomenon. It is very much also a British phenomenon. And we try to show it by taking almost, I would say, not a sample, but the population of all UK-based economists. I'm saying almost because I was not able to find an exact list of who would be an UK economist, but we took 2 ways. First, we checked all the universities' websites and collected a list of every person who said they have an interest in economics, even though many of these people don't necessarily have an entry in REPEC. Maybe they are, for example, teaching only stuff. And then we also consider everybody who has a profile on REPEC, and when they say that they are affiliated to some UK institution, then we have manually checked where have these people been for the last 20 years. From these sources, so looking at their CVs and looking at the information on REPEC, we have come up with a data set that contains information about people's publications, the metadata, so whether they have co-authors, where have their works been published, what are the gel codes used, the references of the paper, and we aggregate all this information by year. Then we know the institutional affiliation of the person, the place and date, if there is one, of the PhD, how many citations the person has received, and so on and so forth. For a subsample, we were also able to find these people's Twitter accounts, and we have looked at their links they have tweeted in the past 2 years. From there, there is a website that we have used to try and create an indicator of their possible political leaning. So what we did is, then we divided the sample between those that we could consider as macroeconomists, and we have 3 possible criteria. The stricter one is people who have written a majority of works using gel codes related to the macroeconomics field, or an intermediate one, so people who have written at least 1/4 of their works in macroeconomics, or a looser criterion, so people who have written at least 2 papers in macroeconomics. And we will compare this population with the overall sample of UK-based economists. Now, we have looked at the personal connection of each person in this sample with each other persons. So in some cases, you have a number of disconnected communities. This, for example, is the affiliations. So people can share affiliations with others, but not with everybody. In other cases, this is citations, you have possibly a more cohesive community. And for all possible pairs of economists in each year, we have computed the number of citations that these people receive. We have used two methods. I'm just showing the results of one because the results are very similar, I must say. So we have used either a final Poisson regression or a zero inflated Poisson regression. So the results are in terms of how many citations author A exchanges with author B, and the coefficient is an incident rate ratio, so it's multiplicative. It means greater than 1, it's a positive sign, lower than 1 is a negative sign. Now, for all these possible pairs, we have computed two measures of scientific similarity, and that would be how many gel codes they have both used up to the previous period, or how many common references they have up to the previous period. If you cite the same works, probably you're working on close topics. And as you can see, both these measures of scientific proximity are relevant. They have a positive impact on how many citations two economists exchange, even when we consider just the macroeconomists. So, for example, every additional gel code increases the number of citations by between 0.4 and 0.8%. Then we have considered a number of measures of differences in the characteristics of these two authors. So what it emerges is, for example, that less specialized authors are more likely to cite specialized authors, except in the strict criterion of macroeconomists. I am not sure about why. Then it also emerges that people who had already more citations in the previous year are more likely to be cited. This is the so-called Matthew effect. So those who already have a lot will receive even more in the future. Then curiously, but I will come back to that, we don't find a strong association of the gender of authors, except that women are more likely to cite other female economists, but men are not less likely, apparently, to cite women. But as I said, I will come back to that. And then, importantly, we have a number of measures of what I called this clan phenomena. So we have looked at whether the two people were co-authors in the year before the citation, and this has a very strong impact on citations. It increases the number of citations by almost 70%, as you can see. We have looked at how many joint affiliations these two people had in the year before. Again, the impact is around 70%. And then we have looked at whether they took the PhD in the same place. Again, this increases the number of citations by more than 200%. It is a little smaller, the impact among macroeconomists, but again, is usually significant except in the very strict criterion. Then for the subsample of people for which we could also find a Twitter account, we also have looked at the political distance. So taking, for example, the difference in the share of tweets that could have been identified as right-wing or center-right-wing. And we see that it has a negative impact. As I said, lower than 1 means negative in terms of odds ratios or incidence rate ratios, except in the strict macro criterion. But I should say this sample is actually very small. So again, political distance decreases how many citations two economists exchange. Now, what is overall the importance of these findings? Well, this means that citations do depend on similarity of topics. This is a statistically significant predictor of citations, but they also depend on social links between people. So for example, if two people are co-authors, if they are based in the same affiliations, and in part also it depends on common, let's say, methodological or ideological grounds. That will be having the same alma mater, so graduating in the same places, or as we saw, political proximity for a subsample. Overall, this means that many people have lower chances of being heard, of being part of the conversation, even though not necessarily, and let's go back to the example of gender, not necessarily somebody is actively trying to discriminate somebody else. For example, according to our model, what would be one of the various reasons for women overall have an average a lower number of citations? Well, women specialize in different fields than men very often. So for women, labor and demographic economics are very important. Health, education, and welfare are important. For men, macro and quantitative methods are more important than they are for women economists. And it is very important to understand that if personal connections increase the chances and the number of citations that you receive, being part of larger communities is key. So if for some reason women or other minorities or anybody wishes to study a topic that is a little bit less studied, that is studied by a community smaller than others, they necessarily receive lower citations. But does this mean that their work is of lower quality? I leave this to you to decide. I would just like to conclude by saying that there are many of these instances. Here I have taken specialization in terms of topics, but as we saw, other important factors were affiliations. So people who are based in larger institutions know more people and are more likely to be cited by these people. Other factors could be the topic that you work on. I think my time is basically over, but for example, deciding to study some economies and not others can affect with how many people you're going to talk, or having a lot of quotas. All these factors have very important and statistically significant impact on how many citations you receive, even though, as we saw, the residual term of gender in our specific equation, for example, in our estimates, were not significant. So there's no unexplained part apparently in the average number of citations that women receive. It is really about who you know and with how many people, to how many people you have access. So to conclude, I think that a lot of biases that are being found around in the literature are relevant, and they should be much more discussed by economists and by people who care about both economic policy and our scientific field. However, it is really not necessary to assume bad faith or corruption in order to recognize that biases exist.
Thank you so much, Carlo, for that wonderful research. I'm sure there's much more to come as you take your ideas further. I would note that Carlo had to work under some adversity. His plan to travel to libraries was foreshortened by the coronavirus, but we see that he's been able to carry on. Let us turn now, and where do we see Beatrice? Beatrice, do you want to load your slides, please? And the floor is yours.
Can you hear me? Can you see my slides?
Everything well, thank you.
Okay, great. So what I'm presenting today are early results of a historical investigation funded by Rebuilding Macro, which I want to thank again for making this possible. And that was carried with a team of interdisciplinary people: Juan Acosta, François Claveau, Clément Fontan, Aurélien Goutmetz, and Francesco Sergi. So what we do here is basically we propose a historical approach to the question of whether expertise is primarily determined by macroeconomic orthodoxy. Several sociologists, political scientists, and historians of central banking have identified a process of scientization across the past 50 decades and 5 decades, 50 years, and across central banking institution across the world. And basically what we do here is that we take the case study of research at the Bank of England to test this idea of a scientization. So what we do basically is that we combine published text, archival evidence, interview, we did a round of interview, and bibliometric text mining and network analysis to understand whether economic research is increasingly shaped by academic orthodoxy. And what we find is that there is no such uniform trends. Rather, there are like several regimes across time, and this is not linear. And basically the way policymakers at the Bank of England use economic research, and the way economic researchers themselves rely on academic work has varied through time and is very much filtered first by shifting mandates and second by the views of governors, chief economics and policymaker MPC member at large. So what I'm going to do now is we identify basically 3 periods corresponding to 3 regimes, and I'm going to walk you quickly through this period and show you a bit of evidence before coming back to this question of cultures of expertise in the conclusion. So our, this is not working, wait. Oh, right. Our first period goes basically from mid-70s to the turn of the 90s. This is the period where, under the influence of Christopher Doe and then John Fleming, research began to develop at the Bank of England, 2 types of research. Monetary expertise, they recruited Charles Goodhart at the turn of the 70s, and also the development of a forecasting infrastructure. This began in 1976 with the purchase of a macroeconomic model from the London Business School, and then there were decades of trying to improve these models, change these models, model the impact of monetary variable better, not always successfully. So that was the kind of stuff that was happening. But that was happening in a context where the Bank of England culture at large was still very much practice-oriented. There were quotes like, "We are a bank, we are here to act, and we are here to understand the banking context. We're not here to do analysis." That were really the kind of quote you were finding. So for instance, the most prestigious job at that time was not chief economist, it was chief cashier. So it was a different type of culture. And most important, the monetary policy was not determined by the Bank of England, it was determined by the Treasury. So that the Bank of England was not even publishing forecasts until pretty late. So basically this creates a paradox. On the one hand, this economic research that is developing is not formally embedded in any policy and decision-making process at that time. It's rather secondary. And paradoxically, this allowed the research done here to flourish pretty independently. You can see here a quote from an autobiographical piece by Goodhart, in which he talks about Fleming, and he says, the core, so he described the 80s basically, and he said the core of life as an economist in the bank lay in the assessment and forecasting of economic data. John Fleming was not oriented toward empirical work. It was much concerned with a proper specification of model, and his main contribution on the modeling forecasting side lay in the introduction of model consistent expectation and other modeling strategy offered by the academia at that time. So what it creates is basically, so John Fleming was the first academically established chief economist. He had edited the Economic Journal like Keynes. And so he sort of pushed for this kind of modeling change. And what you can see is actually research in academic publication becoming important. You see it in the purple line that has a sort of like bump in the 80s, meaning that it's still not a lot of paper, but more academic paper are being published in these years. And then it's going to take more than a decade to go back to the level achieved in the 80s. So you see this is not linear. That's a first conclusion. And the second thing is that you need to be careful in how you characterize how these economists, the staff economists, rely on academic research. A lot of researchers were hired, for instance, Henry and Hall. And in fact, you see that the move to rational expectation, for instance, was not done for theoretical reason primarily, but for econometric consistency reason. That work was pretty close to what was done in the academia, but what was done in econometrics in the academia. You can see it when you compare, for instance, you see on the screen a comparison between the type of academic work Bank of England researcher was citing versus the type of academic work researchers in other central banks like the Fed, the Bank of New Zealand, the Bank of Australia, the Bank of Sweden, and whatsoever were citing, okay? So Bank of England researchers were oversighting in-house econometrician like Hall, for instance, British econometrician like Henry that gets several papers published, other econometrician, Granger, Engel, and they were sitting much less than other a researcher in other central banks, key papers belonging to the new classical tradition, like Lucas, Sargent, Barrow, Kidland, and whatsoever. So there is that sort of like ties with academia at that time that is primarily econometrics. This changed completely at the turn of the 90s for several reasons. The main one is the march toward independence, so the establishment of inflation targeting, and then the formal independence in 97. And you see in that document on the screen that is taken from archive, that is brainstorm done in preparation for the independence, that the Bank of England is being reshaped. Two sort of wings were established, one on monetary analysis and the other on finance. And you see that the monetary analysis becomes quite central at that time. And this has major consequences on the research. Forecasting becomes a key activity. It's institutionalized through the writing and discussion of inflation reports. And what is being done in terms of forecasting is listened to, is commented upon by inside the bank and outside the bank as well. So basically this shapes the kind of topics that is being researched, and it's very much centered on inflation targeting and how to operationalize that and discussion around that, as well as in terms of modeling. Why? Because some people that are decision makers at that time, and in particular Mervyn King, have a very specific idea of how modeling should be done and how it should be used at the bank. So he was chief economist first, and then he became governor. One important thing here is that we didn't try to recover what his view of modeling was, but how his view of modeling was understood and applied by the staff. So that's pretty different, right? And you can see what it is about in the quotes here. So basically he was against, so that's how his views were perceived. He was against big macro models. He found it ad hoc. He was against econometric models and endless regression. He wanted smaller, more analytically founded models. He had a purely theoretical perspective. So the way it was perceived is that basically he believed that proper foundation, analytical foundation, were rational expectation and micro foundation. That was the first thing. But he also believed the main characteristic of the environment was rational uncertainty. And this has several consequences. One was that you couldn't rely on a single model. So you had to develop a suite of models rather than a single model. Second one, you cannot use forecasts mechanically. You have to bring in a lot of judgment. And most important, your model needs to tell consistent story. The purpose of a model is to tell a story, is not to be published in an academic journal. That's fairly different. And this creates, so the way the staff understood that vision sort of creates some tensions in their work in between what Bank of England policymakers want and what academia want. So this result in sort of hybrid models like Beacon that was developed and implemented in the early 2000s, and that actually pleased neither policymakers nor staff nor academic. It has a sort of core plus non-core structure, and policymakers felt that this very specific structure didn't yield good, consistent story. It was problematic to tell story. It was not suitable to the narrative and storytelling, which is a key part of forecasting. So that's the kind of testimony you find here. And in academia too, the model was presented at a conference in the US and seems get a pretty bad comments on the model, saying there is no indication in the Beacon book or in this paper that model is dealt in a consistent, internally consistent way. So you see this kind of tension emerging here. And another consequence that was that the purpose of research at the Bank of England in this year was not to be published in academic journal. That was really clear. And so the Bank of England in this year got the reputation of doing little research. You can see here, the Bank of England has always been perceived as having less priority on research. You should not underestimate how little research was done. So again, this changed with the crisis. So you have two things happening here with the crisis, two big policy shifts. First, the decision and implementation of quantitative easing. And second, the fact that financial supervision mandate was transferred back from FSA to the Bank of England and the establishment of a financial policy committee. What we can see in that period is that first, there were research on these two topics at the Bank of England before the crisis, research on the zero lower bound and quantitative easing, for instance, by Tony Yates, and also the Bank of England has published a financial stability report since the mid-2000s, but the decision taken at that time didn't rely on that research for a variety of reasons that would be too long to discuss here. But then ex post, this policy and this new policy orientation led policymakers to ask new type of research to be developed, and mainly to be developed by the financial stability wing of the bank. And what you see here, you have a figure of the proportion of research that is being cited in speech. And what you see is that financial stability, that was previously a bit neglected, does more and more research that attracts the attention of policymakers at the bank, or that is even commissioned by policymakers at the bank. So you see this shift in topics here. This is the topics of all Bank of England research output since 80. So you see first the emphasis on econometrics in yellow, then you see a shift on monetary policy topics, and then you see slowly growing importance of financial topic in purple, financial supervision and financial market. So what can I get from this story? So here, this is my conclusion, my own interpretation, not that of my team, for the purpose of this session. I don't think orthodoxy, heterodoxy is the most relevant distinction to understand economic research at the Bank of England. Now, I also think that there is a clear academia policy tension. It's real. It results in hybrid research, contradictory demand from policymaker. But again, academic does not necessarily mean theoretical. Okay, there are theoretical views. There are also econometric views. And all this is filtered by policymakers. It's filtered by mandate. So we believe that this filtering of relying on academic research through mandates and through policymakers' view matters a lot. So that's just one type of pipeline we're describing here that goes via the Bank of England in-house research that does not rule out more direct channels, whereby such and such policymaker or such and such researcher would be influenced by academic ideas. Maybe they are shorter one-to-one person pipelines as well, but we don't find it a systemic influence there. And while the Bank of England case is idiosyncratic, we're not saying this is what's going on in central banking at large. Okay, this is just the Bank of England. This is very specific. But this framework that takes into account mandates, policymakers' views, and academic orthodoxy, we find it a pretty useful framework to think about these issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Beatrice, marvelous research. And those of you who managed to hear Andrew Haldane give the keynote on Wednesday will note that he gave a list of topics in which he felt he needed help that very much fit into the policy-focused direction that Beatrice has identified. Let's now ask, where do we have Danielle? Can you please load your slide? And let's go to presentation number 3. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you all see my screen, hear me?
Perfect.
Yes, excellent. Okay, so first, let me thank Gary and Angus for the invite. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'll present an overview of the main results and recommendations from our study group on assessing the impact of the REF on academic macroeconomics. So the issue of the REF and the usage of assessment exercises, this is discussed extensively in the education literature. And we know that educationalists, they emphasize how these exercises can affect knowledge production. However, we know that no work has been done for specific subdisciplines in economics, and this includes the case of macroeconomics. So the main question we're trying to answer here is, what are the main impacts of the REF on UK academic macroeconomics? So our study had three main aims. So first, trying to understand how the REF is affecting the field of macroeconomics. So in what ways the REF and the research audit culture that we have in the UK have entered and affected the incentives in macroeconomics research. Second, how the REF is affecting individual macroeconomists. So this is the more micro level of analysis, how macroeconomists, they respond and they behave strategically to the REF in research and in their career strategies. And then lastly, to understand also the structures of the field of UK macroeconomics. So, and how these structures, they also relate to the REF. So it's impossible for us to understand how the REF is affecting the field without actually looking into the structures of this field and how they behave and how they can affect the knowledge production in our context. So how this was done. So we conducted a mixed method, multi-sourced study, which involved the triangulation of three sources of primary data, both quantitative and qualitative. So this also brings back a little bit the discussion that we had yesterday about the importance of qualitative research. So we collected publication histories of academic economists in the UK across fields, and then looking into the case of macroeconomics in more detail. So this was taken from the Scopus database and the Academic Journal Guide. We also conducted a survey with academic economists and then distinguishing the responses between macroeconomists and economists in general. So the survey, we contacted the participants through the Royal Economic Society and Chud, and also through the REPAC database. And then lastly, we conducted in-depth interviews with a purposive sample of macroeconomists and using a quota system to ensure a mix of institutions, of career levels, profiles, and gender. So some survey respondents, they agreed to engage in a qualitative follow-up. And also the others, they were contacted through the REPAC database and also snowballing, plus the support of secondary literature on field theory, sociology of the economics discipline, and research assessments in academia. So now I'll present the main results that are going to be summarized in bullet points. And also I'm going to bring some quotes from the participants to help to illustrate these main findings. So the first set of results, they really relate to how the REF is affecting the field of macroeconomics. So our findings, they point out to a few results. So first, the issue of epistemic narrowing. So participants, they report an over-specialization in macroeconomics in the UK as an effect of the REF. There's also the tendency towards more applied work. So participants, they perceive the REF as valuing more applied work, and some also report the need to have to change topics or approaches because of that. There's also the less incentives to long-term and interdisciplinary research. So for some, long-term research is seen to be as too risky. There's no time for other projects that won't lead to publications, because publications are the thing that are most rewarded. There's also some general skepticism towards the impact agenda. So many participants, they said impact is very hard to prove in macroeconomics. And this top-down agenda from the REF to push for impact doesn't work for our field. Also the monoculture of methods via journals. So many macroeconomists that engaged in our study, they perceive the field as being relatively open to new approaches, especially after the global financial crisis, but less so when it comes to methods. So they see that journals and editorial boards, they're largely responsible for that, because journal publications, they will then feed onto the REF submissions, and less openness to new macroeconomists entering the field. So the REF is affecting hiring practices largely for junior people who don't have strong publications. Some departments say it's too risky to hire cutting-edge thinkers or those who do interdisciplinary projects if they also need to tick the REF box at the same time. So also, we also had a few views between the different sub-panels in the REF. So the economics and econometrics sub-panel was mentioned to be as having a bad reputation or excessive scrutiny. So some participants, they said the economics and econometrics panel, it's only elite economists in elite departments with a very specific view of economics assessing research quality. And this contrasts with the view on the business management sub-panel. So a large proportion of macroeconomists based in business schools, they see that sub-panel as having much more wiggle room, especially when it comes to publishing journals that are outside economics. So I brought a few quotes here to illustrate that. So the first economist says, "I am unable to write more than a paper because still I am under the constraint that I have to produce 4 papers, and you don't take the risk. I'm sure that brilliant people, probably they're going to be able to do it. Probably Keynes was going to write his general theory under our circumstances, but definitely other people, they wrote very interesting books at the time, they weren't going to do it. It kills this long-term research." A second economist says, "The REF doesn't encourage hiring junior people, basically. If you exclude the top institutions that can afford to hire, and by top institutions, I only mean LSE and UCL really, nothing else. Everybody else is scared to hire a junior person." Lastly, is there an openness of topics? Yes. Is there an openness of methods? Less so, in the sense that they're open to any type of, I've seen papers on interbank loans, interbank markets, all sorts of topics in finance, but they have to be incorporated in a particular framework if you want a traditional macroeconomist to read it. So our second set of results, they refer to how the REF is affecting individual macroeconomists. So how it affects their research, what they do about that, and also some general feelings. So our results, they point out to the following points here. So first, the need to be more strategic about publishing decisions and engage in game playing. So the participants, they target specific high-ranking publications, or they need to publish more across the board, so lower-ranked journals, but more quantity, to make up for the fact that they have less 4 stars. So they say things like tick box exercise and increase their refability is quite common in the vocabulary. Also choosing topics strategically. So they say that they have to adapt research as much as possible, as you need to publish on journals that will get you promoted. So the REF is much more linked for promotion and career progression, especially for early career researchers. The strategic choice of research outlet. So using journal rankings and lists to increase the refability. So some things that they say here in quotes, you start from the top and then you slide down. And others, they say in quotes, you never go below 3 stars. And also the issue of wrong incentives. So a lot of participants, they say that quick turnover research is incentivized. So they say that the REF is actually distorting incentives. So it's not about doing the best, more cutting edge, long-term research, but a culture of immediatism and pointless research. And quite surprisingly, we see that the REF is affecting certain groups differently. So this really depends on institutional affiliation, career seniority, and gender. So professors in elite departments, and mostly male professors, they report very little worry about the REF. So in quotes, they say it's another admin layer, whereas for junior staff or macroeconomists in less prestigious departments and more proportionally female macroeconomists, they say, in quotes, it is a matter of life or death. So I brought a few other quotes to illustrate that. So one person says, "That's why I'm adding these other research strands, but they certainly take me away from my core areas of interest. I think in the short term, I need to do what I'm doing, which is diversify." A second economist says, "Why are you trying to get into the top journals? Because the REF wants it. I think you need to be more strategic. I need to be more strategic because that's ultimately what people are doing. They're playing a game like that." And then lastly, your interest then, it was not to publish something worthwhile, but where and how fast. It is what the REF does now. It gives very wrong incentives, or it gives incentives that distort the behavior of academics to unwanted ways, because you don't want to bury thinking just only for the sake of publishing. So going into the last set of results about the governing structures of macroeconomics. So here we have a few results that our participants, how they view the field of macroeconomics. So first, as we know, the enduring dominance of US macroeconomics of methods, topics, professional institutions, and journals over the UK and also elsewhere. They refer a lot to the issue of elitism and hierarchies. So particularly top departments and editorial boards of top journals, they are seen as, in quotes, a closed elitist club. So to take the terminology that Carlo used in terms of club, some participants, they refer to the same thing. Negative feelings towards new ideas of approaches. So even though some individual macroeconomists, they perceive the field as being relatively open, there is also a feeling that the top players are not open at all, in the sense that there is still a monoculture that dominates. So in quotes, they say, diversity is seen as a race to the bottom. Also, the issue of macho culture emerged. So aggressiveness, toxic masculinity, and biases against women. And finally, the point of a strong publication culture. So nothing else matters. Publication is the key for survival. So here are a few final quotes. So one economist says, you go with the dominant method, which is obviously from the guys in America, and they run the journals. So as long as they can keep publishing with the existing methodology, they're not interested in anything new. A second economist says, there are research groups and that basically not dictate the agenda, but when they exclude such papers, they, by not allowing to go to the review process or to get published, they basically guide the current and future generations of researchers to a very specific way of thinking. And finally, it is very masculine. There are not many female macroeconomists. In my department, I think the preeminent macro people are fairly kind of toxically macho. Macro seminar audiences are much more aggressive than the other seminar audiences, for instance, and that probably doesn't fit well with my personality. And so I've stayed away from the core macro side and gone into more labor, softer, more applied work because of that. So what these results point out regarding the REF affecting macroeconomics. So are they actually friends or foes? So here I bring 3 concluding points. So first, the REF exacerbating the norms and cultures that exist in macroeconomics. So I'm not saying that macro has changed or macroeconomics is as it is just because of the REF, but the REF is contributing to the reinforcement of certain patterns that exist and were reported by the macroeconomists in the field. So here we can think about the REF as being largely a tool or an apparatus, if we want to use the STS terminology. And to assess the impacts of the REF really will depend on how each discipline and field behaves. In the case of macroeconomics, we see that the REF is reinforcing the existing cultures that exist in macroeconomics through 4 main channels. So first, by increasing the influence of intellectual elites that dominate the upper levels of the field, so especially elite departments and editorial boards of top journals. Also by intensifying the publication culture that exists in macroeconomics. By affecting how new generations of macroeconomists, they can enter and stay in the field. So a lot of early career scholars, they report how they really depend on good REF results and how departments, they're very reluctant to hire people with less publications or projects that are considered to be riskier. And also stimulating research in topics that are more publishable in detriment to groundbreaking, riskier, or interdisciplinary scholarship. The second point that I bring is about the monoculture or diversity in macroeconomics and the role of journals and the REF in that. So there is a clear link between the lack of methodological and theoretical diversity in macroeconomics with the journals, or how the current editorial policies that are employed by top journals in the field can limit potential change, as the REF inevitably will hand more power to journals because journal articles will feed onto REF submissions. Also, many participants, they reported how the REF subpanels are not perceived as particularly diverse, especially when it comes to institutional affiliations, approaches, and methods. And then the third point that I like to bring is something that came up as one of the results. which is the issue between the REF subpanels versus universities. So maybe there's a signaling failure here. So when we do a document analysis of the working methods and the working criteria of the REF subpanels, they actually signal quite, or at least some diversity and inclusivity in comparison to actually what is being reported by the academics. So this really begs the question of the middle layer between academics and REF subpanels, which is the role of universities. So the power of universities and the influence of mock refs. So how universities and research directors are selecting these outputs that will go on to REF subpanels. So finally, I know I'm running out of time here. So this is my final slide with some recommendations that we can think about. So first, a more formal, transparent, diverse, and inclusive system of recruiting the REF subpanel members. So this really echoes what has been said in this Stern review, with different individual profiles, affiliations, ideas, and approaches. Also, the idea of anonymizing submissions so that REF subpanels don't know names, departmental affiliations, and where the research was published. Encouraging, and also here I stress the clear signaling for diverse and new output types, so not just emphasize journal publications. More regulation from the UKRI over the process of mock refs and how universities are selecting these outputs. And then finally, changing the funding structures. So instead of the REF being just based on quality related research, why not incorporate a part of a block component of funding for universities? This comes also to the fact that many academics, many macroeconomists in not that much prestigious departments or bottom institutions, they report a lot to the issue of an unfair playing field. So changing the funding structures can also change a little bit this inequality that exists between different institutions in the UK. So I'll stop here. And thank you very much. I hope we can have some good questions.
Thank you very much, Danielle. And let us go directly to our discussant, Jagjit Chadha. I think that Jagjit also has some slides to load. So Jagjit, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Gary. Thank you, Beatrice. What typically happens during Zoom at this point is I then fall off the internet. So it looks like I'm still on at the moment. I can see smiles, so it seems like I'm still working.
Oh, good.
Well, good morning. Thank you very much. Thank you, Gary. Thank you very much indeed, everyone. As I said, I very much enjoyed thinking about the culture of expertise, and there's a lot of intellectual history there. My mind was cast back to someone I spent a lot of time talking to at graduate school, who himself was a great historian of economic thought, the dearly departed Maurice Perlman, who got me very interested in many of the issues that we're talking about this morning. And of course, that we confront at the National Institute regularly as we try to think about not only the research frontier, which is a ragged frontier, an uncertain frontier, and one which, as a number of people have pointed out, and which I'm convinced about as well, involves a large degree of herding. Herding may be good, herding may be bad, but I can be convinced there is a lot of herding in there. And we as a sort of policy institute at the National Institute, an independent one, have to adopt a variety of approaches. And that's highlighted both in the approach to macroeconomics, but also in any study of social household phenomena. We have to go beyond often the technical frontier, whether it's mathematical or econometric or data-driven, into qualitative areas as well, to try and come up with some robust conclusions and ideas that mean something for all. So I'm very much plugged into this idea of social macroeconomics and what that means. And I think at some level, it's something which the research frontier in macroeconomics is dealing with as well, in the sense in which it's obviously the case that aggregate policies have unequal consequences across the income, social, or regional spectrum. And those inequalities themselves may act to drive, amplify business cycle phenomenon or long-run prospects of prosperity. So there's a key interaction between these things that need to be understood at the intellectual level, which is what we're talking about this morning, but ultimately in terms of policy consequences. So I'm very much in tune, I think, with the comments that we've had so far this morning. I want to start my discussion with, in the first instance, if I can get this thing to work, there we go, by just highlighting, you know, what I would say the brilliance of some of the economists that we've had working in the UK in the last half century or so. Very sadly, Sam Britton passed away the week before last, a great commentator on economic affairs, a governor, one of the Institute's many governors for many years. And I just point to something he wrote in the aftermath of the financial crisis. You can get it online. It's August the 6th, 2009, almost exactly 2 years after the freezing of the interbank markets. He wrote this piece. And I refer to this because it seems to me so immensely influential in terms of the view of macroeconomists subsequently, the development of this very funding stream that Angus has been running, the Rebuilding Macroeconomics agenda, as well as the perception, I think, that many of us have touched upon this morning in the presentation. So I can't put the whole article up, but I've put some slivers of it in front of you. And this famous question the Queen asked when she visited London School of Economics about the great financial crisis and why no one had seen it coming. And the question is, should we have? I mean, to what extent is macroeconomics responsible for a financial crisis? To what extent are epidemiologists responsible for COVID-19? I mean, it seems to me a very convenient set of people to blame for something that was ultimately a policy failure, and ultimately as well, but also an issue about the failure to control the strength and dominance of financial capital, which is not in any way, it seems to me, the responsibility of
Jagjit, we're losing your transmission a little bit.
Universities on macroeconomics, but nevertheless, it was convenient to perhaps make it more good. Also, Britain is the economists are and what forecasting is about. But also, have I frozen it working? What's happening? Thank you very much. So, Gary, thumbs up. Is that working?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
All good.
Yeah. We have a lot of demand on the network where I live, so at particular times. Thank you very much. So, the next question is the one on forecasting, and that's, I think, touched upon by a number of the presentations, but perhaps in particular, Beatrice, in the way that you think about the Bank of England and the need for various models, not one meta model that summarizes everything, but also the need for narratives and discussions of issues that are consistent with a view rather than letting the model drive all the ideas. But within that as well, there's no idea, no sense at all in which economics or macroeconomics should be about trying to predict the unpredictable. It's something that we know can never be done. So it's very much more about taking a view. And that is something I think Sam Britton was himself very clear about. It's also not terribly clear, I'll come to this point later on, in terms of when we think about it, who is an economist? How would you define them? And within that group, who is a macroeconomist? There's finance, there's people working in business schools, there are people working in the city, there are people talking about macroeconomics who work for the BBC or newspapers. So I kind of ask myself that question continually in terms of who or what do we think is a macroeconomist, and particularly with the points raised about the centre of gravity for the profession. Is it in the UK, is it Europe, or is it elsewhere? Does it matter where macroeconomists are from? And Sam made the point some 11 years or so ago when he wrote this op-ed for the FT. Would it be the case that within the foreseeable future that people's children and grandchildren will not be taught at university by UK-born economists and by association macroeconomists? And the question is that important in any way in the discussions that we have? And we'll come to that later on when I discuss the papers. But I want to just point out that many of the things that we're talking about this morning have been talked about in policy circles and in the macroeconomics field for quite some time now. That doesn't mean we've come to a conclusion, but it doesn't also mean that people aren't worried or concerned about the issues that have been raised. I could start with Carlo's incredibly impressive collection of data. It's quite remarkable how he's been able to, I don't know whether the right phrase is scrape the web or put together this kind of data. It seems to me worthy of a lot more analysis over time. So I hope this isn't the final paper we see from the Carlo factory looking at all this data. There's probably a lot that can be mined in the future. But if I could just point to his conclusion, he argues that, or his team argue as well, that debates are heavily affected both by the contents of written pieces of research and by the social and scientific connections between their authors. This inevitably results in several forms of bias that we should aim to mitigate and correct. Now, I don't want to take issue with that. I absolutely understand the sense of it, but I want to just raise a few questions, and I want to do that with each presentation if I might. So I'm not here taking issue with the results or arguing with them. I'm going to take them in good faith, and I know that these are, each of these presenters are very serious people with some very interesting insights. So my question then is this any different from any science? If we look at the number of people contributing to any paper in Science or in Nature, or indeed the kind of papers that Sage have been producing with much interest in so far this year, is there any observable or measurable difference? And is there any distinction between economics and macroeconomics? This is a field of research about macroeconomics per se. So are we able to bring out any specific distinctions there? I wasn't entirely convinced we are. And that doesn't mean I don't believe that there are. I'm just saying I'm not entirely convinced that we were able to bring out serious distinctions within our particular field. And relatedly, I would argue that research is a common activity and a common good. So in that sense, herd effects may not be all bad, in the sense in which you want to bring people together, you want to have interactions. That's the very reason we have an institute in Westminster off Smith Square, to bring people together to talk about their ideas. And that, if we believe in increasing returns to scale, might be a healthy thing. Now, I completely accept the point that if those very same people then erect barriers, then that's a problem. But in the first instance, in the development of ideas, it cannot be a bad thing necessarily to have herd effects. But I'm very happy to be told I'm wrong. I normally am. If we go on to the next point, we use the word bias very freely here. And in one area of economics, home bias, I kind of know what that means. I examine a well-diversified portfolio and I say, well, given that portfolio and your appetite for risk, I may want to have a certain fraction of my assets invested domestically. So I know exactly what the bias is. I go underweight or overweight against a benchmark. So what is our maintained portfolio when we talk about bias? Is it in particular fields? Are there particular conclusions that we think were wrong because they were driven by bias? Or is there something else going on? The word bias is a very easy one to throw at people, but without a definition of what is normal or appropriate or correct, it's one that is terribly damaging without actually necessarily being constructive. So I just want to put that to, if I may, in absolutely a positive manner. If I could then move on to Beatrice Cherrier's kind of quite, I mean, I have been monitoring and involved with work at the bank throughout a large part of my career, and I don't think I take issue with the interpretations offered in any way whatsoever. They're very accurate and highly plausible in terms of where they are. And I think of this, if I may, as an intellectual history of the Bank of England rather than an official history. The official histories in the recent past by Forrest Cappy and the one published last week by Harold James are clear administrative histories of the bank. Where this is terribly interesting is as an intellectual history. It's combining the ideas that are coming out of the frontier of macroeconomics with how the bank deployed them through its chief economists. I should say Christopher Dow was deputy director of the National Institute before moving to the Bank of England. John Fleming himself was famously on the train down from Oxford a few days a week. And then of course, Mervyn King as the next chief economist in the 90s. So these are all very well-known characters trying to move the intellectual frontier into the bank in its practice. And I think the paper does a very good job of that. May I just sort of throw open some further questions to Beatrice, if I may? How about the bank's role in nurturing the UK profession? What can we say about that compared to, say, the Federal Reserve or the ECB? If we look at the Federal Reserve, its system across the country, which might be thought to be analogous to the bank agents across the country, nearly every macroeconomist is in some way or other in the States attached to one of the regional banks that actually have quite a diverse research agenda. And that might be something the bank might be in a strong position to do, nurture diverse opinions. And the ECB, to some extent as well, has those kinds of relationships through its various networks. I wonder as well, to what extent is bank policy still stated rather than debated? So, we have now decided to move to negative interest rates. Or the alternate way, that would be a statement. The alternative way would be to debate it, issue a white paper and say, here are the pros and cons. Let's invite opinion from across the macroeconomic spectrum and move towards a decision some way down the line. That's where policy will be debated rather than stated. It's still too often the case, it seems to me, that policy is stated. And that might be an interesting avenue for Beatrice to investigate. And then that leads to the next point. Those of us, lucky enough to have been born and brought up in the UK, we're familiar with the idea of the Treasury view. And that's this idea that the Treasury always wants to pursue tight fiscal policy and doesn't particularly believe in the public sector's ability to supply things terribly efficiently. That's a very unfair statement on the Treasury, but I've only got a couple of minutes to summarize all this stuff. So is there a bank view? Could such a thing be said to exist? If not, how should a bank, such as the Central Bank of the Bank of England, reflect the genuine disparities in opinion that you have at the frontier? Nobody really knows, for example, what the long-term consequences of COVID are. But when you've formed a view, that to some extent drives your policy response. And if there's therefore disparity in view, there's disparity in policy choices. And I wonder how well either the bank is doing that or how well we can capture that with our intellectual history. Let me move on, because I'm sorry I have to have dropped off early on. Danielle, really enjoyed the discussion on the REF, and I want to just respond to three of the main points made very briefly. I've put the 3 points up, if I may, Danielle, from your paper. And I just want to say that the REF is increasing the weight on impact. So that's the idea that it's providing incentives for people to go outside of journals and, perish the thought, but talk to the press or talk to the media or talk to students and talk to people at school. All those kinds of things is something the REF is serious about increasing. Maybe it hasn't done enough yet, but that is something it is very much interested in. I wonder to what extent, again, this is similar to the point I made to Carlo, is this solely a macroeconomics problem where it doesn't strikes me as being a bit harsh on macro if we compare it to other subjects and other disciplines. I hear the same kind of issues being raised in many other areas. So it would help us all if we could be a lot clearer to say, look, this is the thing that is specific to macroeconomics. And that might best be done by talking about particular policy failures or research failures. One defense we might say, and I'll take points 3 and 4 together, in defense of macro, have we gone through a deep period of methodological innovation? Is that one reason we've taken a step back? The development of micro-founded models that ultimately have now led to the need for household data analysis using administrative data and other household level data now leads to papers that are very heavy on data and on theory that ultimately require teams to construct them. That's why interaction with places like the bank, or may even say the National Institute, are terribly helpful. And to the extent to which that requires access to long-run resources, that becomes a barrier to entry that's a real rigidity for the brilliant person working in a department somewhere in the regions who hasn't got that team of people around them, has found interaction difficult because right now it's more obvious than ever, but particularly if it requires a train fare to the place where the work is being done, it gets very hard. So I'm just trying to say maybe there are some real rigidities out there in the way that macro is now done that makes it very hard for the 2 or 3 people that may be in a regional economics department, who I completely agree are able to do this work, but may not be able to. And then that might require some mechanisms to be brought about, either through UKRI or HEFKI or the universities themselves, to promote that kind of work, because it seems to me that's the way macro is going. Very data heavy. So much more like a lab, a science lab, where you need a group of people working together rather than the sole genius at Leeds, Gary, for example, writing papers on his own. It just doesn't work that way anymore. So let me just sum up, if I can. What's the landscape of the culture of expertise in economics? Clearly, we know all this stuff. It's what do we need to do to the education, A-levels, undergraduate courses, postgraduate training, vocational opportunities? How do we get these ideas into the career options facing macroeconomists? How do we get our learned societies to promote that? That's the Royal Economic Society, the Statistical Society, the British Academy and the Royal Society. Are they doing enough? Didn't hear so much discussion about that, but not sure we are doing enough with those learned societies. What can we do more in terms of journal publications? We know which the best journals are, but is there enough incentive to write critical surveys? How do we get our ideas out quickly? No point in having an idea 10 years ago and still trying to get it published 10 years later. That strikes me as a bit of a dead weight loss. Maybe we can do something to encourage more early dissemination of ideas, and how that might also mean op-eds in journals and other things. And one thing we have got in this country is a lot of media outlets. And so there are media opportunities through press, radio and TV. I don't say that in any way to wish to dilute the excellence or the competence of the research that's being done, but it's something we don't do that well. I couldn't stay up late enough to watch it, but I think, for example, Joe Stiglitz was on Question Time last night. So, let's think about more ways by which macroeconomists and people on this call, not me, but others, can do that kind of stuff and get their ideas out there. And I think that's an incredibly important part of the culture in this country. So let's think a little bit more about the gaps and weaknesses in this landscape as well, which perhaps moves on from the papers we've presented, but as a response to the landscape that we have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jagjit. Now, let me suggest the following. We've got, by my count, exactly 23 minutes before our break for lunch, and now 22. So let's do the following. Let me ask each of our three presenters to spend first 3 minutes responding to Jagjit's comments. And then after that, I've been accumulating questions both for all panelists and then for specific ones. So we'll have at least one round and maybe two of going back and forth, but I would ask the panelists to please be succinct, and let's take those comments in the order in which they were delivered. So Carlo, you first.
Thank you very much, especially for the very insightful comments. I agree with many things that you have said, and also that the other panelists have said. Let me very quickly, it will take, of course, a lot more time to answer in full. What is specific about the subfield of macro? Well, to be honest, at least that is what we are working right now. You have seen in the presentation, I had 3 different definitions of how potentially you could call an economist as a macroeconomist. Something interesting, I don't want to go into too much into the details. Something interesting that we find is that over time there is an increasing specialization of papers, but not of people. So this means that it's difficult to define somebody as just a macroeconomist, especially, therefore, my answer in general to you would be, is there a strong difference in the findings between macro and microeconomics? I believe no. I think the most clear difference is if you consider those to be subfields of economics, I do in part. The more clear differences will be with other fields, the very small ones, such as history of economic thought, or cognate disciplines, such as management studies or firm organizations, managerial economics. There you really think, then you really see a difference, I think. In what terms? Well, I agree with your basic premise. There's no predicting the unpredictable. If I understood well, you said the importance is to take a view. In my view, the importance when it comes to funders, to policymakers, and to anybody who's interested in the field of economics as a whole, would be in granting, the importance will be in granting that there is a plurality of different views. So I totally agree, herd behavior is not necessarily something bad, Actually, I don't think that science is an individual effort. It is a collective effort, as you said. This means, for example, that the way that we think about research evaluation and the funding of research should also change, in my view. There's no point in evaluating single individuals. Sometimes you, for example, find rankings of universities based on papers that authors have written with colleagues based in other universities. So how could you then attribute a certain paper to one university or the other? This is just a stupid example, of course, to say that I think it's important to take the view that we should have a plurality of different approaches, and we should explicitly reason in terms of groups of people, or if you prefer, in terms of research approaches, paradigms, and schools, in a sense. So to conclude, I did use bias a little lightly, possibly. So for example, to some extent, it's obvious that somebody is more likely to cite their co-authors because they know this person better. But would you say the same for people based in the same affiliation in the era of internet? And even more important, why should you be more likely to cite somebody from the same place where you took your PhD, even if possibly these are the people you have never met because they have taken the PhD in a totally different time, or even a political difference. I know Twitter is a specific case, but why should it matter in which people do you cite? I think we can reasonably agree that these are some signals of possible bias.
Thank you very much. Beatrice.
Yes, so I got, there's a lot of questions, so I cannot answer them all. So feel free to shoot an email if I didn't understand, if I didn't answer the question. So there's a lot of question on who are the staff economists, where do they come from, what are the networks? So I'm going to do a batch response here. We do have data, which I didn't have time to show, and we are not done with the use of them. For instance, I can tell you that overall, 18% of master and PhD, the master's and PhD degree of Bank of England economists are overall on the whole period, 18% LSE, 10% Oxford, 9% Cambridge, 8% Warwick, 4% Birkbeck. But what is interesting to us is whether, for instance, the relative dominance of LSE is a new thing or whether it's been stable across. So we want breakdown by period. So we are not finished with showing this data. Mm-hmm. On the question whether they're part of international work networks, yes, to some extent. They were already going to Econometric Society meeting in the 70s. But I mean, there is really UK specifics there. I mean, in the well, up to the crisis, the great financial crisis, the PhD recruited at the Bank of England was 75% UK PhD. So this is much more than in other central banks. So the international, and now we are down to 30%. So there was a huge internationalization very late, much later than in other central banks. So you got these sort of networks, international networks, but you have that sort of like UK-based problems, UK-based, how about the exchange rate, do research in other countries, tell us stuff, or are we too specific in whatsoever? That plays a huge role. This is also a central bank in which for a long time, it didn't matter if you had a PhD or not. I mean, like a BA was sufficient for a long time, then an MA was sufficient. In the mid-70s, in the mid-90s, only 50% of Bank of England economists had a PhD, for instance. So that's part of who these people are. Matthias asked, did you do some network analysis of Bank of England economists and other macroeconomists not associated with the Bank of England? We've started doing that. But personally, I'm not sure what we can get from that because of the fluidity of the identity that is specific to the UK. That's been shown in Marion Fourcade's book, for instance. A career in the UK for a staff economist, not a top official at the Bank of England, but for a staff economist is basically being a professor, then being a Bank of England economist, then being a professor, then going to NIESR or to Treasury or to an institutional, then being a professor. So I'm not sure the separation between bank Bank of England versus not Bank of England macroeconomists really makes sense. And this ties in with a question asked by Jagjit on the bank's role in nurturing the economic profession. In my view, and I don't want to involve my team in that, this is really my personal response. I came to work on the Bank of England from working on the Fed. So I've done more work on the Fed than the Bank of England. So yes, much less than the Fed, as I showed in the quote. So first, the Bank of England didn't recruit that many master and PhD, and then throughout the 90s and 2000s, it was not seen as a research institution or an institution in which you can do research easily. So and it was not the case for the Fed. And as you said, I won't say that the Fed nurtured dissent, but there were dissent emerging at the Minneapolis Fed, at the St. Louis Fed very strongly. There is not this. There is not much that seems.
Those are warring armies there.
Yeah, I mean that's the. Jagjit also say, is policy stated or debated? Well, that depends on the personality of the governors and the MPC member. One interesting episode is at some point there were debates on whether the staff should publish a distinct forecast, like would have the MPC forecast, but also the staff forecast. And they decided against it, and that says stuff about this discussion on how much you want internal challenge within the bank and why. As you say, if you want a clear policy view, you gotta have some unity. So you got pros and cons. I'm just saying that were stuff much debated within the bank at some point. And two more quick comments. Mary Morgan asked about. Like the external MPC member had their own research facilities. They even had their own research paper discussion at some point, whether this changed the research. We had very contradictory result from our interview round. Some people say, yeah, these external MPC members were directly challenging modeling choice. So this forced the staff coming to MPC meeting to justify their choice, their very technical choice, and other people say, no, it didn't matter. The internal cooking in the model didn't really surface. So we're not sure what happened there. And the last question is about, why don't you mention DSGE? Well, Compass was a DSG model. That's the last one. Beckham was not a DSG model. And even in the case of Compass, yes, they were DSG models. They were used to do forecast, and forecasting rounds are about mechanical versus judgmental and what story you want to put on top of it. So that matters, but saying stuff like DSG influenced the monetary policy of the Bank of England is really a long shot, as I hope our research show. So
okay, what's happened here is that Beatrice has done a marvelous job at responding both to Jagjit and to many of the questions asked. So what we'll do is first ask Danielle to respond specifically to Jagjit, and then I will try to bundle some of the other questions. We've gotten a good immersion. I have a couple of things I'd like to add too. Danielle.
Thanks, Gary. So thanks, Jagjit, for the comments and questions. Very interesting points. So I will respond based on the evidence that we had from what the participants said. So regarding the impact, I think for some participants that was a welcomed agenda to include that impact. However, many said that in macro, it's very hard to prove the impact. So many participants said maybe this is something that should be more flexible with how the ref said. I remember a participant saying, if you cannot sell as a massive impact case study, which is hard to prove, then this won't be picked up by my university's mock ref, and therefore my case for impact won't be picked up by the ref subpanel. So maybe there's some scoping for flexibilization on what the subpanels consider to be deemed as impact and how you prove and how you sell this impact. On the second point regarding only macro, so the interviews especially, they gave also some evidence because some of the participants, they were also doing some work. They were macroeconomists, but also doing some work across different fields, especially econometrics, finance, and labor. And I asked them about the differences. Do you see differences between macro and other fields? And they said yes. Especially not just, and probably the most surprising one was econometrics. I remember one of the participants saying, in econometrics, it's very straightforward. Either it is or it isn't. So people have to accept what you say. And in macro, it's not. It's very parochial. You have the clubs and they dominate. So it's very hard to get your ideas through. So of course, macroeconomics will inevitably mirror some of the structures that we have in the broader economics discipline, but clearly more research is needed to understand the differences in those fields. So I don't think, based at least on the evidence that we had, we cannot bundle together, just assume that that's a problem of the discipline, because clearly there are differences in fields as well. And the final point about the methodological innovation. So of course, that's a broader turn in the discipline. So Beatrice has a paper on that, on the applied turn in economics. But also, I think it begs the question on, there is methodological innovation, there is new approaches coming up, but is this changing the top players in economics, in macro more specifically? Is this changing the top players? Is this changing the top journals in the field? So I think it begs the question on how the REF can also address this, if it welcomes more diversity of ideas, because clearly, as I said, there is a signaling failure of what the REF subpanels is saying, that what they accept and what the participants report. So how can the REF subpanels consider this, incorporating other journals, other ideas, other methods? Because this is something that clearly it's still mirroring in the field of macroeconomics as being very rigid. Yeah, I think I'll stop there. And
thank you. Let me just begin by, I'm going to summarize questions, and I do think we have probably time for one, maybe two rounds going around. But let me just make two comments. That we had both a closed Gresham's House Rules seminar in October 2018, and another one in March 2020. And so notable people with experience in the MPC and Bank of England were involved. And actually, there was an active discussion about the need in the what Beatrice identified as the middle period for the MPC members to have their own staff, that there was a back and forth about what was the ruling view. So that was something very interesting that came out. The thing I would mention, and I think Marcus Miller, I know, was there, of those here with us now, in 2020, just before, I guess it was actually, it was a virtual conference. In fact, I remember Goodhart didn't join in our March 2020 workshop because he doesn't like virtual. But those who were there, Marcus, you'll remember, there was strong commitment on the part of our experienced veteran central bankers on the need to do more, to do a lot. Their commitment to policy process was remarkable. And I found that kind of interesting. The legacy was very real there. Now, I'm going to actually begin with a question that then Marcus threw out, which I'd like to ask the other two panelists, Carlo and I think maybe Carlo in particular. This might be interesting for you to follow up. He asked, since we had such discussion about the importance of general equilibrium in macroeconomics, why haven't we had more in discussion of the DSGE and its acceptance within the macro paradigm as biasing the research possibly? Now, staying with Carlo, there was a comment by Matthias Thiemann about your quoting of Calusi's study. It looks like the collusion had nothing to do with journal quality in what he observed there. And Ivan Bodirev asks, would you, and he's asking, I think, specifically Carlo, but I'd like to throw this out to everyone, including Jagjit. Would you formulate a proposal based on your evidence to increase pluralism and openness in UK economics? And, does your research lead to this proposal? Would that be something in which you'd be interested? Then let me turn to Danielle. One question that also comes from Ivan is how involved were macroeconomists themselves in setting the benchmarks of REF? Was that something that was, important there? And Danielle, we also have from Caroline Bentham, how much do your findings apply to other fields of economics? I think we see the same curiosity that Jagjit mentioned in his comments. And when you talk about macro being perceived as more macho, is it that it's more men doing it, or is it about the culture of exchange in that? And I myself, I would probably, in my experience, say both, but I'd like to know your answer. And finally, one more for Danielle specifically. Is the REF in macroeconomics particularly uninclusive? How have other fields been more inclusive? How have other fields done better? And I think there's one more for Beatrice that I think didn't come up in her overview of some of the comments, was basically, does your research allow you to identify which researchers come into the Bank of England? Are we looking at, I know there's some conversation about LSE and so on, but are we looking at people coming straight out of school? Are there people coming into the Bank of England from the private sector? I know that Haldane's has had an interesting influence. And then in addition to that call for, is there a way to make for a more open and wide-ranging macroeconomics that I would throw out to all of you, Paul Fisher has an interesting comment about just mentioning that, publication has changed, that we see the IMF and BIS with their working paper series really throwing out a lot of great information and ideas and models very quickly. Look at Claudio Borio's work on the global, financial cycle and so on. And even Helene Ray, her interaction with Borio has really not come so much through waiting for the publications in all the journals. So what about the problem of more rapid transmission of ideas? Why are we so journal bound? And that raises the question of whether there's tension between the REF and the rest. And finally, I would just mention Mary Morgan wonders about more applied papers in macro, and Danielle Torri, kind of going back to the first question, wonders about what are the incentives for young and more heterodox scholars to want to enter into economics and specifically macroeconomics. And I would just mention that Andreas Joseph has an interesting comment I would urge our panelists to look at in the chat function that's about the interaction between Bank of England and other central banks around the world. If I could ask everyone for 2 minutes to respond, and we'll go again in sequence. We'll start again with Carlo, and then Beatrice, Danielle, and we'll give Jagjit the last word. So, Carlo. Carlo, you're mute.
I'm sorry. So I do not mean to say that discrimination or corruption do not exist. For example, there is an interesting paper in the 2014 issue of Research Policy on a survey on European economists. What I think it's important is to stress that the denunciation of single episodes of corruption should not prevent us from talking about structural discrimination. So just to make an example, this is a slide that I did not have time to show during my presentation. Here you have the share of times that a certain country or the corresponding adjective is used in titles or abstract or keywords of papers published in the top 5 journals in black or in the top journal of the specific country. So to make an example, if you are an economist working on the UK economy, you will be glad to know that almost half of paper published on the economic journals somehow contain this metadata. So either they are about the UK economy or they mention it somewhere. However, in the top 5 journals, this is less than 5%. So your chances to enter the top 5 journals are, of course, a lot higher if you instead talk, for example, about the US economy. This is just one small example of what I mean when I say that we should not necessarily think in terms of active discrimination. There can be things such as structural discrimination, so constraints on what you can or you cannot do if you want to be recognized as top or good, or if you want to receive funding, for example. So coming to the—
Maybe one more comment?
Yes, to the proposals. I think that the most important thing is that we should have a lot less a hierarchical field. As I said, pluralism would really be my main concern. And for this reason, a specific proposal I did in the past, at least, for example, in the Italian context, was that you should always normalize your evaluation. So you should evaluate a macroeconomist only against other macro people. You should evaluate an historian only against other economic historians, and so on. The obvious answer that I received was, but you cannot say that all fields are equally worth. So here, you really see how this is really a value judgment. In the end, it is about what sort of economics you want to promote in society. Because I'm sorry to say, economists do respond to incentives.
We do indeed, and none of us can compete with the apparently 200 annual publications of our colleagues in sciences. Beatrice.
Okay, two short comment on the do they go to the Bank of England straight out of school? Well, they have had internship programs in partnership with PhD programs for a long time. But then let me repeat that for the staff, the standard career is not to spend your whole career at the bank. It's to go from treasury to academia to bank to other places. It's different for top officials. Until recently, they wanted like people that they move from one area within the bank to the other so that they know everything by the time they assume responsibility. But staff economists, yeah, you can do your master or your PhD while interning at the bank. How much it matters, whether there is sort of bank view among the staff, I don't know. I find it questionable. And as for the link with business, yes, of course. I mean, you don't want to get the chronology wrong. The link with business was everything at the beginning of the 20th century. Yeah. So you got quotes like, there is an atavistic practice, a loyalty to practice over theory, to market touch over everything else. The tradition is to decide, not to deliberate. That's where the bank come from. This is not specific to the Bank of England. That was the same at the Fed. So the tie with business is really the basic DNA of the bank historically. So let's not forget that.
Thank you very much. And Danielle.
Okay. So thank you everyone for the questions. So very briefly, so the first question about macroeconomists involved in the REF. So the REF panel has experts in many subfields in economics, so not just macro, micro, econometrics, economic history, etc. Based on what we saw from what the participants said, is they see the view that the REF is relatively diverse when it comes to those different subdisciplines, less so when it comes to methods. But there is a general feeling, and that reflects in one of the proposals that we raised there, is about the REF panel needing to be a bit more diverse when it comes to affiliations, when it comes to ideas and methods as well. On what it comes on the question for the macho culture in other fields of economics and how that's different from macro. So again, based on what was reported, in comparison to other fields from participants that worked in other disciplines, labor, econometrics, and finance, they tend to perceive macro as being fairly more macho, in the sense that it is both, as Gary said, more men working and more the toxically macho culture, hostile, inflexible, and the top players of the club still dominating the culture, much so. As about the question on other fields doing better, so is the REF only in macro and inclusive, are other fields doing better? I think my answer to that would be, we just don't know, because we don't know exactly how the REF is affecting other fields in economics apart from macro, which is what we saw in the results of our research. But this, of course, opens up more scope to do more research in how the REF affects other subdisciplines in economics. It may be just conjectural of my part, but it tends to look that micro, in comparison to macro, tends to be a bit more inclusive based on a few perceptions that I saw from the participants, but that's just conjecture for my part.
All right.
Finally, sorry, just a question on the incentives to young scholars. So I would say it's hard because the top 5 still stands as this obsession on the economics discipline with the top 5. And this is where I point out to what the goals of the REF panels, the REF sub-panels are. Is it to exacerbate the existing cultures of economics, or is it to provide a counter rate? Because as Carlo said, we economists, we respond to incentives. So that's the question that goes back to the REF sub-panel.
Absolutely. And I would add to Danielle that, look, it's not about top 5. You have to choose the topics, methods, and ideas that you believe in. And in every case, find your audience, find your interlocutors, and be serious, drive each other to be better, more relevant, and more policy focused would be my suggestion. Jagjit, the last word, save for turning it back to Carolina, is yours.
I can see we're in negative time, so I'll be very, very brief. I'd say that, I mean, what Gary said is a maxim we should all adhere to. We have to explain what we do to young people not at university, to our colleagues who are not macroeconomists in other areas, get them to understand what we're doing. That will be the first part of having more impact for what we do. A very good example would be within universities themselves. Too often within universities, the people deciding whose REF proposals go through don't understand either economics or macroeconomics well enough. And I'm afraid that just takes time, just as it does speaking to the press or speaking to students at schools or anything else. It takes time, and some of us need to invest in that to get people who are making decisions about our futures to understand what we're about. And part of that also, as Gary just said, is identifying the right questions. Just one final point, if I might. There was a few questions about whether we talked about DSG or not. I worked almost exclusively in the area of DSG, but I avoid using the phrase because it seems to lead to hackles being raised. So we talk about micro-founded models. We're just talking about things that ultimately think about the household budget constraint or the firm budget constraint and add up in aggregate to a general equilibrium problem. So I think the whole phrase has moved beyond that. And that's why when I said that a lot of macros become data and theory heavy, requiring a lab or a group of people to work upon, that is a serious point. It's not a point to be taken lightly. That's why the center of gravity is going to move away from individuals working on their own to groups of people working in labs and teams. That then means we need to think about university structures and structures of departments and places that allow that to operate. Otherwise, those working in the regions, however defined, will always be at a distinct relative disadvantage for getting their work to be noticed. But let's do what Gary says, identify the key issues and pursue them courageously and consistently throughout your career. You may not end up with a bestseller, but at least you've done what you think is important. And I think that's all that matters.
Thank you very much, Jagjit, for that word. Carolina, over to you.
Thank you, everyone. I will be very quick because we are really running to our break. Let's resume the conference at midday with remarks on policy with Chadha Minister of Science, Research and Digital, Chi Onwara. So please come back at midday with your sandwich, your juice or whatever. And thank you, this amazing panel. And of course, Gary Dymski and Jagjit for leading that and the researchers. And I see you soon. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Carolina.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Gary.
That was great.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.